Jeremiah. You don't hear the verse, homie, better hear the choir. Too many people lost, don't know that they near the fire. You better fear Messiah. I'm in the ghetto preaching Christ with they cooking crack. I gave my life to the king and I ain't looking back. They say works, why you so passionate? I ain't gon' stop till it starts to look like the book of Acts.
Gotta reach the lost, no matter the cost. Gotta try to save another soul. Gotta reach the lost, no matter the cost. Gotta try to save another soul. I got a question: when you die, just think, where will you go? If your name ain't written in that book of life, it'll burn your soul. I don't know about you, but the one thing that strikes fear in the heart is the Lord to look you in your eye and say, I never knew you go in the dark.
They asked the Lord,
the creator of heaven and the universe, Jesus Christ.
Astronomer George Smoot at the University of California, Berkeley declared, "What we have found is evidence for the birth of the universe." He added, "It's like looking at God." Arno Penzias shared the Nobel Prize in Physics for the discovery of cosmic background radiation. He said, "Astronomy leads us to a unique event, a universe which was created out of nothing, one with the very delicate balance needed to provide exactly the conditions required to permit life, and one which has an underlying, one might say, supernatural plan." Astronomer George Greenstein, in his book The Symbiotic Universe, asks, "Is it possible that suddenly, without intending to, we have stumbled upon scientific proof of the existence of a supreme being?" And Stephen Hawking has conceded, "It would be very difficult to explain why the universe should have begun in just this way, except as the act of a God who intended to create beings like us."
I'm skeptical of the claim.
I'm skeptical.
I'm skeptical.
Yes,
I'm
skeptical.
We are skeptical
Of claims for the ability of
Random mutations.
And natural selection.
to account for the complexity of life.
A careful examination
Of the evidence.
For Darwinian theory
Should be encouraged.
skeptical
Skeptical.
Skeptical.
skeptical
of claims
for the ability of random mutations
and natural selection
to account for
the complexity
the complexity
to account for the complexity of life.
Careful examination.
examination
Of the evidence.
For Darwinian theory
should be encouraged.
As a scientist,
Microbiologist,
Biochemist.
as a geologist,
Neuroscientist.
physician.
biologist and an engineer.
I think there is overwhelming evidence for intelligent design in nature. I see intelligent design in the history of life.
In the genetic code of life.
In the molecular machines inside our cells.
In the complexity of life.
In the information embedded in living things.
In the operation of the human brain.
In the features of the human body.
In the chicken and egg causal circularity of life.
As a mathematician, I see great evidence of purpose in the universe.
As a molecular biologist, I see evidence for design everywhere I look, pretty much. Nature is incomprehensible without inference to purpose and to intelligent design.
The properties of the universe as a whole, and our planet in particular, were fine-tuned for our benefit and for our survival.
In my view, the fossil evidence clearly points towards intelligent design.
I see life as designed because when I look at life at the molecular level, I see exquisite engineering.
all cells contain DNA, which include lots of information, and information is only the product of a mind.
Darwin thought living cells were just blobs of jelly, but when I look in a living cell, I see evidence of factories, machines, three-dimensional architectures, enormous amounts of encoded information.
There's power generators, there's manufacturing plants.
Life contains many features that we know from experience only arise from the activity of intelligent agents.
The genetic code is like a software program. It's like somebody would have had to be a coder, would have had to form this particular genetic code. When I see that order and design, I have a really hard time believing that random mutation and natural selection alone can cause the complexity and the diversity we see in life.
When you look at nature at large, what you see is incredible examples of innovation which surpass human technology. Examples include the flight capabilities of a hummingbird, sonar in bats, and greater innovation always implies greater intelligence from a designer.
If you read the message from the molecules, it's really clear. They say clearly, intelligent design, intelligent design, intelligent design is the source of life.
In fact, in 2003, Arvind Borde, Alan Guth, and Alexander Vilenkin were able to prove that any universe, which is on average in a state of cosmic expansion, cannot be eternal in the past, but must have an absolute beginning. Vilenkin pulls no punches. He writes, "It is said that an argument is what convinces reasonable men, and a proof is what it takes to convince even an unreasonable man. With the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning."
We will restore science to its rightful place and wield technology's wonders.
A scientific method is based on the collection of data through observation and experimentation. Science Daily.
Could you give me some observable evidence that evolution is true? Something I don't have to receive by faith.
Yeah.
Some observable evidence.
I mean, take a look at what happened 65 million years ago.
Hang on, I can't. That's 65 million years ago.
I believe, millions of years.
So that can't be observed.
We can trace the evolution through the fossil record.
Could you be specific? Just give me one.
Between 6 and 7 million years ago.
Hundreds of thousands to millions of years?
So it's quite a long time? Yes. Millions of years? Yes. So it can't be observed?
Evolution is not testable over time.
We are condemned to live only for a few decades, and that's too slow, too small a time scale to see evolution going on. Richard Dawkins. We see nothing of these slow changes in progress until the hand of time has marked the lapse of ages. Charles Darwin.
The information that is stored in the DNA molecule is pointing back to a designing intelligence. Now, why do I say that? It has to do with what we know about the cause and effect structure of the world. Our local hero in Seattle, Bill Gates, says that DNA is like a software program, only much more complex than any we've ever created. And that's a very suggestive remark because we know that programs always come from programmers. And in fact, we know generally that information, whether it's in a computer program or a hieroglyphic inscription or in a headline in a newspaper or a block of text in a book, information always comes from an intelligent source. So when we find information in the DNA molecule, the most logical thing to conclude is that it too had an intelligent source.
Due to this primitive level of science at the time, the imaginary scenarios of the theory of evolution were not looked upon as odd at all. Darwin's theses had a great impact on the scientific circles of his day. However, Darwin was still distressed. In the chapter Difficulties on Theory, he wrote, "If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed, which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down."
As far as I'm concerned, I'm here to tell you, Michael, this morning, and Jason, evolution is dead. Long live the creator. I'll tell you why, and I'm saying science says that as a scientist. Evolution is dead because there's such thing as the minimal gene set concept. They've taken a mycoplasma, smallest organism, Mycoplasma genitalium, which is the smallest organism that is known to exist, has 468 genes. Genes is a mix of proteins, right? A list of, so it can be 1,000, can be 10,000 amino acids. Okay, there are 486, and they've decided since year 2000, they've said, let's try to reduce it. Because we have to start, if you're going to be an evolutionist, you have to start with 0 genes and build up if you're going to go from hydrogen to human. And so, somewhere along the way, they said, well, let's take it down. In the year 2000, they published that even on paper, they couldn't go below 200 genes. On the 6th of January 2006 in Nature, they published that in reality, you could only go down to 397 genes. So a cell, which is where my specialty lies in my scientific work, a cell needs a specific number of components to be functional. You have a membrane, but then you need to feed the membrane. So you have to have some mitochondria. You need a way of tagging the proteins. You need some DNA. So you need 397 things. Just the glucose cycle for getting energy takes over 6 different genes. So if you don't have one of them, you don't have any more energy coming to the cell.
Darwin's fears proved to be true soon after his death. The laws of inheritance, discovered by an Austrian botanist, Gregor Mendel, caused Lamarck's and Darwin's assertions to collapse. The science of genetics that developed at the beginning of the 20th century proved that it was not acquired physical traits, but only genes that were transmitted to subsequent generations. This discovery made it clear that a scenario suggesting that acquired traits accumulated from generation to generation and generated different living species was implausible. In other words, there were no inheritable variations for Darwin's proposed mechanism of natural selection to choose from. Subsequently, the theory of evolution as advanced by Darwin has been collapsed early in the 20th century. All the other efforts by evolutionists in the 20th century could do nothing but only confirm that natural selection had no evolutionary power. A famous evolutionist, the English paleontologist Colin Patterson, admitted this when he said, "No one has ever produced a species by mechanisms of natural selection. No one has ever got near it, and most of the current argument in neo-Darwinism is about this question." When it was clear that the mechanism of natural selection proposed by Darwin had no evolutionary power, evolutionists had to make a fundamental change in the theory. In addition to the concept of natural selection, they added a second mechanism called mutation. Mutations are alterations or distortions that take place in the DNA of living beings, mostly as a result of external effects such as radiation or chemical action. The theory of evolution now holds that living things are differentiated from one another and develop as a result of mutations. This cannot be true, for mutations only damage the information in the DNA and give only harm to a living being. No beneficial mutation has yet been observed either in nature or in laboratories. Since mutations do not add new genetic information, it is impossible for living beings to acquire new organs through mutations.
Is new information being generated? That's what evolutionists have to come up with. Right. They have to have a mechanism that generates new, never before existing genetic information that can build all these bigger and better structures.
Right. That supposedly never existed before.
Right. Right. Never before existing information. Back when there was only a single cell that gave rise to all the diversity of life, there wasn't information for skin and hair and heart and a brain and so on. Right. So you have to generate it somehow, according to evolution. Right. Now, Dr. Werner Gitt is an information specialist. Since we're talking about information, we'll go to an information specialist. He wrote a book called "In the Beginning Was Information" that you and I both love. And in his book he says this: a code system is always the result of a mental process. It requires an intelligent origin or inventor. It should be emphasized that matter as such is unable to generate any code. All experiences indicate that a thinking being voluntarily exercising his own free will, cognition, and creativity is required. He goes on to say, there is no known law of nature, no known process, and no known sequence of events which can cause information to originate by itself in matter. Right.
This is why Professor Richard Dawkins, one of the most renowned advocates of the theory of evolution of our day, hesitates when he is asked to give a single example that increases the genetic information.
Professor Dawkins, can you give an example of a genetic mutation or an evolutionary process which can be seen to increase the information in the genome?
The truth is very evident. Life has such a complex design that can never come about by chance.
And I suppose it's possible that you might find evidence for that if you look at the details of biochemistry, molecular biology. You might find a signature of some sort of designer.
Wait a second. Richard Dawkins thought intelligent design might be a legitimate pursuit?
Richard Dawkins is his name. Arguably the world's most famous atheist. I don't know how you would test for that, but maybe we'll ask him. So, right off the bat, what's wrong with, in your opinion, with believing in a God, regardless of who the God is?
I think it's false. I think that it's a matter of belief without evidence. And I suppose it's possible that you might find evidence for that if you look at the details of biochemistry, molecular biology. You might find a signature of some sort of designer.
Wait a second. Richard Dawkins thought intelligent design might be a legitimate pursuit?
And that designer could well be a higher intelligence from elsewhere in the universe.
Alfred Russel Wallace was one of the leading naturalists of the 19th century.
He shares credit with Charles Darwin for discovering the theory of evolution by natural selection. But if Alfred Russel Wallace tried to talk about his views in a science class today, he would likely be banned. Because Alfred Russel Wallace, the co-founder of the modern theory of evolution, also believed in intelligent design. Wallace's embrace of intelligent design is one of the forgotten chapters in the history of science. But it's an intriguing story that places current debates in a new light. The year is 1869. The place, London. 10 years earlier, Charles Darwin had launched a revolution with his theory of evolution by natural selection. According to Darwin, natural selection refuted the case for intelligent design in nature. It showed how living things that appeared to be designed could have been produced through what was in fact a blind and undirected struggle for survival. Darwin thought his theory of unguided evolution was sufficient to explain all of life once things got started, from the smallest insect to man himself. But now, Darwin's claim is about to be challenged. And the challenger is someone people would least expect. His name, Alfred Russel Wallace, co-discoverer with Darwin of the theory of evolution by natural selection itself. In April of 1869, Wallace makes a shocking announcement in the Quarterly Review, one of London's leading journals.
Neither natural selection nor the more general theory of evolution can give any account whatever of the origin of conscious life. We may go even further and maintain that there are certain purely physical characteristics of the human race which are not explicable on the theory of variation and survival of the fittest. The brain, the organs of speech, the hand, and the external form of man offer some special difficulties in this respect.
According to Wallace, to produce such exquisite features as the human brain, evolution required guidance by what he called an overruling intelligence. Darwin is shell-shocked by Wallace's announcement.
Darwin is absolutely aghast. In his personal copy of the Quarterly Review, he writes in the margin of Wallace's statement about the overruling intelligence an emphatic no with big exclamation points. And then he writes back to Wallace and he says, I can't believe, in effect he says, I can't believe that this was coming from you. And he says, EU, your miserable friend Darwin. I mean, in other words, Darwin wanted nothing to do with even this faintest hint of an overruling intelligence, that he was strictly bound by his sort of rule of methodological naturalism, and that Wallace had overstepped the bound. Well, from that point on, they remain cordial, and they certainly correspond with one another extensively. But Wallace never really, he sort of becomes, as Ross Slaughton says in his biography, a heretic in Darwin's court.
In the years that followed, Wallace eventually developed a theory of intelligent design that historian Michael Flannery calls intelligent evolution.
Wallace's theory of intelligent evolution was a belief in common descent that was directed, that was detectably designed and purposeful.
Wallace's conversion to intelligent design was grounded in science rather than religion.
Alfred Russel Wallace did not come to his views of intelligent design or intelligent evolution from theistic ideas or for a search for a theistic explanation. What he did was he argued what was the central principle of natural selection. The central principle of natural selection was the principle of utility. The notion that no animal will ever acquire any attribute unless it affords it an advantage in the natural world, a survival advantage. Well, he looked at certain things in the natural world, for example, the intellect of man, humanity's love of music, wit, abstract reasoning, mathematics, all of those things. He said, well, there's no survival advantage to this. So if that's the core and the essence of natural selection, one must go beyond that and search for some other satisfactory explanation. One thing Wallace knew, he knew that complexity had to be designed and had to have some kind of design apparatus or some kind of manufacture. You don't get machines out of nothing. They don't arise spontaneously. They don't just pop up out of nowhere. So they have to have some kind of intelligence, or as he would sometimes refer to it, an overruling intelligence or a mind behind these complex apparatus in nature. And so he was just making a logical inference, not from a gap in the evidence, but from a need to explain something that the natural selection model was incapable of explaining, and that was certain aspects of complexity. Complexity of the cell isn't explained by it, the complexity of the human mind isn't explained by it, and quite frankly, the origin of life isn't explained by it. I mean, natural selection has to have something to work upon. So when you look at those things, how does complexity arise? Well, Wallace knew, just as we know, that complexity doesn't just arise. And remember, Wallace had witnessed the dramatic demonstrations of Louis Pasteur against Felix Pouchet and absolutely demolished spontaneous generation. The idea that, you stick some, hay in a vat and, it just spontaneously generates these little microscopic creatures. Well, what did Pasteur tell us? Life begets life. So the idea of spontaneously generating things out of chance and necessity was thoroughly uncompelling for Wallace.
The full expression of Wallace's embrace of intelligent design came during the last decade of his life with the publication of 2 books. The first was Man's Place in the Universe. Here, Wallace went beyond the Earth to consider the evidence for intelligent design in the universe as a whole.
He, in the Man's Place in the Universe, says that man holds a special and unique place. And we know that by looking at the requirements for complex biological life, the position of the Earth not only in the solar system, but in the galaxy itself. He did not have the modern Hubble telescope to tell him about the Big Bang theory of the universe, nor did he have the modern observational techniques of astronomy. But he did have, again, logic and inference. And he knew that the many, many cataloged requirements for complex life to appear on the Earth was probabilistically demanding of something unique.
But Wallace's most important work in favor of intelligent design came 3 years before his death. It was titled The World of Life. Over 400 pages, it was Wallace's magnum opus, a grand synthesis of his half-century's work in the topic of evolution. By now, Wallace had concluded that intelligent design was pervasive throughout nature, and that guidance was required not just for the development of man, but for nearly everything.
In the minutest cells, in the blood, in the whole earth, and throughout the stellar universe there is intelligent and conscious direction. In a word, there is mind.
Wallace was especially fascinated by what he called the mystery of the cell.
The cell is not a mere particle of protoplasm, but is an organized structure. What we must assume in this case is not merely a force, but some agency which can and does so direct and guide and coordinate a great variety of forces, mechanical, chemical, and vital, so as to build up that infinitely complex machine, the living organism, which is not only self-repairing during the normal period of existence, but self-renewing, self-multiplying, self-adapting to its ever-changing environment. To do all this, what we absolutely require is a mind.
Remember, at this time, when we're talking about the cell, August Weismann is beginning to explicate in greater detail the mechanisms of cell division and so on. People like Huxley and many of the followers of Darwin just believed that the cell was just a sack of protoplasm. And Wallace said the cell is much more intricate than that, much more sophisticated than that, and it gives evidence of design.
The wonderful activity of cells convinces me that it is guided by intelligence and consciousness. I cannot comprehend how any just and unprejudiced mind, fully aware of this amazing activity, can persuade itself to believe that the whole thing is a blind and unintelligent accident.
Wallace also marveled at the wings and feathers of birds.
He also used the example of the bird's feather and wing and constructed it as an interlocking mechanism that had to work in a certain way. And each of the parts had to work and function properly, or the feather itself failed to serve its purpose.
I almost think a feather is the masterpiece of nature. No man in the world could make such a thing, or anything in the very slightest degree resembling it. Someone has said that a single feather from a heron's wing is composed of over 1 million parts. The quill is socketed, held together by little contrivances in the nature of hooks and eyes. It is of a material so light that a finger can twist it out of shape. But if it gets pierced or separated by any slight blow, it becomes quickly reunited and restored. Watch a bird sailing high above the earth in a gale of wind, and then remind yourself of the lightness of its feathers. And those feathers are airtight and waterproof, the perfectest vesture imaginable. The bird's wing seems to me to be, of all the mere mechanical organs of any living thing, that which most clearly implies the working out of a preconceived design.
So he would use specific examples in the natural world that are remarkably akin to some of the modern examples that are being used today to show detectable design in nature. Wallace did not have the tools of modern ID theorists today, for example, DNA. He did not have information theory, but he could use logic and inference to draw the examples of intelligently detectable design in certain features of nature, which is what he did.
Alfred Russel Wallace breaks the stereotypes usually associated with intelligent design today.
There are those who say you cannot believe in intelligent design and be a scientist. If that were true, then Alfred Russel Wallace would never have been considered the father of biogeography. In the seminal work on the geographical distribution of animals, which he published in 1876, after he had already bolted from Darwin in 1869. A good deal of his work took place after his embrace of intelligent design, and some of his most important scientific works, which would put him on the map as a leading scientist, were a product of those post-intelligent design years.
Nor did Wallace fit the stereotype of a right-wing Christian.
Alfred Russel Wallace is a very inconvenient historical figure for those who would want to caricature the intelligent design movement as a bunch of right-wing creationist Christians. Wallace wasn't a Christian. He wasn't within that context a creationist. He didn't subscribe to Scripture. And he wasn't by any stretch right-wing. In fact, he was a declared self-avowed socialist. He believed in land nationalization and a whole host of other progressive, might say left-leaning political views. So this idea that all believers in intelligent design are sort of right-wing, Bible-thumping creationists is belied by the fact that virtually every aspect of Wallace's life and career goes against those notions. This from the very co-discoverer of natural selection itself.
So what is Wallace's relevance for us today?
Alfred Russel Wallace's greatest legacy to science is to give us a different view and a different perspective of what science is and how science should function and operate. That legacy that Wallace gave us, unfortunately, has largely been forgotten.
C.S. Lewis's critique of scientific utopianism was at the heart of his novel That Hideous Strength, which tells the story of a conspiracy to transform England into a scientific dictatorship. The conspiracy is led by a government bureaucracy with the deceptively innocuous name of the National Institute of Coordinated Experiments, or NICE.
I think that Hideous Strength and Huxley's Brave New World are the two greatest dystopias in our language in the 20th century.
The agenda of NICE in That Hideous Strength reads like a wish list drawn up by the era's leading scientific social reformers. It included sterilization of the unfit, selective breeding, biochemical conditioning, experimentation on both animals and criminals, and above all, truly scientific planning.
A scientific planning that is pretending to provide a new humanity that is doing away with traditional ethics, that is doing away with all traditional restraints.
Lewis depicts a world in That Hideous Strength in which nothing is sacred. Daniel Bell has told us that the essence of modernity is that nothing is sacred. In The Abolition of Man and also in That Hideous Strength, we see the consequences of a world in which nothing is sacred, which includes the human person. The human person is not sacred, and when that happens, there are no distinctions between individuals or humans and animals or humans and vegetables or humans and minerals, and we have the kind of thing we've had in the 20th century.
In the 2 decades before his death, Lewis became increasingly alarmed by the rise of scientific authoritarianism.
Lewis was very concerned by the dogmatic use of science, and that is why he wrote his novel That Hideous Strength. That is why he wrote his book The Abolition of Man, where he actually worries and somewhat sort of predicts the rise of a new class of people, of experts speaking in the name of science, who would dictate to everyone else. In fact, by the end of his life, Lewis was worrying about the rise of what he called scientocracy. government and society that claims to be based on the claims of modern science, but in reality really is based on a scientific clique of a few people who are speaking in the name of science. And maybe they are adopting the majority view of science, but they're claiming the right to rule based on their scientific knowledge and expertise.
Lewis's concern about authoritarian science seems eerily prophetic. In a world driven by science and technology, those who question the new order, like C.S. Lewis did, increasingly find themselves labeled anti-science. C.S. Lewis would have rejected the charge.
Lewis did not accept the idea that science was a special form of knowledge that was somehow immune to inspection, that was somehow cordoned off from the non-specialist assessing the deliverances of the sciences. Lewis was well aware that, first of all, that there's no such thing as science as such. There are sciences, and each science has its particular methods and its particular areas of study. And also that the sciences, to be good, need to interact with one another, but they do so by means of the larger tools of good, rational, critical thinking. And so that the things that the scientists say are subject to review by everyone who is able to think well, to think critically, to think rationally.
Lewis did not deny that scientific expertise might be necessary for good public policy in many areas, but he insisted that science alone was not sufficient.
Knowing, say, how things work, knowing how cells work, or knowing how ecosystems work, doesn't tell you what you ought to do for your society. Because public policy is not just about the technical expertise of how things work. It's about what good is worth having at what price. And as C.S. Lewis pointed out, on these questions, a scientific training gives you no added value. Scientists are not moral philosophers, yet political and social judgments involve not just how do things work and how can we make them work better, but how should we act, and what's worth spending money on, and what's worth doing, and what freedoms are worth giving up or not. And on these sorts of moral and ethical questions, someone's science training doesn't give them the right to dictate to the rest of society. C.S. Lewis thought that science was a good thing, but he also thought that it held some really strong dangers. The biggest danger really was the penchant to control. In a scientific view, if you think that is the only way that we have knowledge of the world, and so if you think that if I have the scientific truth about something, that's end of story, I know everything. That really tends to feed a power trip. Whether you're a scientist or you're a politician who's trying to latch on to the prestige of science, you really have people who are going to abuse their power because they think, look, we're the only ones who know what should happen because we know how the universe really works. Therefore, we should be able to dictate what our cultural beliefs are. We should dictate what our government should do, how we should design governmental programs. We should dictate all manner of public policy, and that anyone who doesn't have a scientific training or isn't part of the consensus view of science is basically stupid or against progress or against science, and so should be really swept by the wayside and shouldn't be listened to. And I think Lewis thought that that almost totalitarian impulse was really a dangerous thing. Lewis, I think, was properly so frightened by that potential within science, and that's why he stressed why we really need a way to understand the limits of science, and that there is something behind science, a larger transcendent ethical sphere behind science, and that we aren't just blind matter in motion, that we're part of a designed universe that actually sets limits on what we should and shouldn't do.
It's an age-old problem. How do we prevent something good from being twisted for evil ends? C.S. Lewis hoped that scientists themselves would find a way to rescue science from scientism, creating a regenerate science that respected human rights and honored human dignity, a science that would no longer be the magician's twin.
By the last decades of the 19th century, Darwin's theory was increasingly popular among Germany's intellectual elite. Darwin had claimed that humans and other mammals were the product of what he called natural selection, a blind struggle for existence where the fittest survived and reproduced, and the less fit died off. In his book, The Descent of Man, Darwin made clear that his idea of natural selection had implications for human society.
Charles Darwin clearly was a social Darwinist. He was not as rabid a social Darwinist as some of his followers later on, but he clearly did believe that Darwinism should be applied to human societies.
Darwin worried that civilized societies were harming humanity by helping the poor, caring for the sick, and otherwise saving those who nature would have killed off. Darwin feared that such humanitarianism could eventually destroy the human race. Darwin also predicted that in the future, the civilized races of mankind would exterminate the inferior ones. Darwin himself was ambivalent about some of the social implications of his theory. But in Germany, Darwin's ideas supplied a new generation of political leaders, social thinkers, and scientists with what they regarded as a biological justification for world domination.
If you read the scientists of the day, in the late 19th and early 20th century, many of them were promoting racism and even racial extermination, extinction of races. They were promoting the gaining of living space. They were promoting competition, the things that we know of as social Darwinism. These were things being promoted by Charles Darwin himself to some degree, many other leading biologists.
The war of annihilation is a natural law, without which the organic world could not continue to exist at all. German zoologist Gustav Jäger, 1870. Just as in nature, the struggle for existence is the moving principle of evolution and perfection, so also in world history, the destruction of the weaker nations through the stronger is a postulate of progress. German ethnologist Friedrich Hellwald, 1875. According to Darwin's theory, wars have always been of the greatest importance for the general progress of the human species. The physically weaker, the less intelligent, the morally lower, must give place to the stronger. German biologist Heinrich Ziegler, 1893.
Not all German Darwinists defended war as a biological imperative. Some, in fact, criticized it for undermining natural selection. They feared that wars in Europe would kill off too many of the superior races. Yet even these pacifist Darwinists tended to approve of wars waged against races they considered lower on the evolutionary scale, like the native peoples of Africa. And it was in Germany's colony in southwest Africa, now known as Namibia, that the social Darwinism of German military leaders moved from theory to practice in the years leading up to World War I. Between 1904 and 1908, the German military attempted to eradicate the Herero people in southwest Africa in what some scholars consider the first genocide of the 20th century. On October 2nd, 1904, General Lothar von Trotha issued what became known as his extermination order, declaring that the Hereros either had to leave German southwest Africa or face extinction. Herero men would be executed, and Herero women and children would be driven into the desert where they would die of starvation or dehydration. Von Trotha justified his extermination campaign by an explicit appeal to social Darwinism, telling one newspaper that human feelings of philanthropy could not override the law of Darwin's the struggle of the fittest. When von Trotha's extermination campaign provoked a backlash in Germany, a new plan was developed to move the remaining Hereros to concentration camps, where many more would ultimately die from malnutrition, disease, and exhaustion. In these death camps, the Hereros were subjected to medical experiments by German doctors, and their skulls were collected for shipment back to Germany to be studied by experts in racial science. By 1908, it's estimated that more than 80% of the Herero people had been eliminated from German Southwest Africa. Back in Europe, meanwhile, German military leaders prepared for the next conflict on their continent. In 1912, German General Friedrich von Bernhardi published his bestseller, Germany and the Next War. Bernhardi argued that the struggle for existence is, in the life of nature, the basis of all healthy development. Therefore, war is a biological necessity. Similar ideas could be found among the military leaders of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Count Franz Conrad von Hotzendorf has been called by one scholar the architect of the apocalypse for his formative role in World War I. The chief of the General Staff of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, von Hotzendorf, read Darwin as a young officer, and he soon applied the Darwinian worldview to his ideas about foreign relations. After World War I started, many German thinkers invoked Darwinian theory to justify the conflict, including prominent zoologist Ernst Haeckel, previously a pacifist.
Once it got going, there were many people who argued that it was a part of the Darwinian struggle for existence. Ernst Haeckel even wrote a book during the war in which he called it part of the struggle for existence, in which he argued that the perfidious French were using black colonial troops against the superior Germans. And he found that horrifying, that they would do such a thing. And so there were many people who were justifying the war on as part of the Darwinian struggle for existence.
In the end, Germany and its allies lost the First World War. But the ideology of social Darwinism that inspired its academic and military leaders survived for another day. Among the defeated soldiers of the German war machine was a young corporal in the Bavarian army. Intensely bitter at the defeat of Germany and its allies, the corporal found new purpose for his life by embracing an even more fanatical social Darwinism than that which had been adopted by the leaders of the Second Reich. Within 2 decades, the whole world would know the corporal's name.
Unser deutsches Volk siegt ein! Sieg 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 ein!
We got a problem here in evolutionary theory. That is that if you have the stuff and they somehow replicate, the fact is you got to have information guiding the replication. Where does the information come from?
Well, that is a huge problem for origin of life researchers. Assuming you have these prebiotic compounds, they now have to be converted into biomolecules that can carry out function, and all biomolecules are information laden. For example, proteins carry out virtually every activity in the cell, and they're made by linking together smaller molecules called amino acids. Kind of like putting together letters to make words, the cell puts together amino acids to make proteins. Well, the probability of hitting a functional protein through a random assemblage of amino acids is roughly 1 chance in 10 to the 75th power.
It's just one protein?
This is one protein. Now, what does that probability mean? Well, if you assumed optimal conditions for the origin of life, where these amino acids could come together once per second, it would take 10 to the 23 years to have a 95% chance of getting a single protein, but we're talking about maybe needing almost 2,000 proteins for life to emerge. Now, as Hugh has told us, the universe is 13.7 billion years in age, roughly 1.3 times 10 to the 10 years in age, meaning we've gone less than 1/trillionth of the time we need to produce even a single protein, let alone those 2,000 proteins that need to come together simultaneously for life to emerge.
Hey, but my philosopher and theologian here, in light of what he's saying as a scientist, what do you make of the textbooks that we just held up, where they say the most important concept in biology is evolution, and nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution?
Well, there are some very serious problems of a statement like that. I mean, as Fuzz has pointed out numerous times, life appears suddenly. It appears in a complex form. And in looking at that kind of statement about evolution, it would seem that the evidence runs against it rather than supporting it. From a logical point of view, it appears to be an assumption rather than the kind of conclusion you draw from strong evidence.
Do you believe in intelligent design?
Of course not.
Do you think everything is intelligently designed?
No, I don't believe that things are intelligently designed.
Okay, you seem like an intelligent person, so I'm going to ask you something. I'd like you to make me a rose, okay? How would you make a rose?
I don't have the capabilities to do that.
Hang on. No, it's not intelligently designed, so you should be able to whip me up a rose real quick. Do you believe a rose is intelligently designed?
Definitely not.
In order for me to know what to make, I have to know what a rose is.
Well, it's got a seed, so you've got to start with nothing and you've got to create a seed from nothing.
Oh.
Can you do that?
No, I can't.
Could you make a rose from nothing?
No.
Can't make something from nothing. It's just basic, science.
A rose from nothing?
A rose.
Just like, I can't, honestly.
Why not?
Me, I have no supernatural abilities.
All the geniuses in the world can't make a grain of sand from nothing. We don't know where to start.
I can't.
Why not?
I don't have millions, billions of years.
That would be physically impossible. I mean, I would have to, that's not possible.
So how could you say everything's not intelligently designed? Where does that leave you on the scale of intelligence if you say everything's not intelligently designed and you can't even make a rose?
Why do you think there's no one teaching intelligent design at UCLA?
Because they're not allowed to.
We can teach anything we want.
There's a reason intelligent design isn't taught in our learning institutions. According to physicist Victor Stenger, the legal staff of Freedom from Religion Foundation, a church-state watchdog group, has had remarkable success in convincing many institutions, such as school boards and town councils, that they are breaking constitutional law when they sponsor sectarian activities. That includes intelligent design. When the authorities can't be convinced, Freedom from Religion Foundation sues, and it wins more often than not.
New at 6, Satan in our schools. It's a topic going wild on social media nationwide this week.
The Satanic Temple is vowing to put an after-school Satan club in elementary schools all over the country. That group is saying that they're not actually worshiping the devil, but promoting freedom of religion.
Faced with these realities made clear by the fossil record, evolutionists directed all their attention to the claim that man evolved from ape-like creatures. 6,500 different ape species have lived so far, and the majority of them are extinct. The skulls of these extinct apes, both big and small, constituted a great resource for evolutionists on which to exercise their imaginations freely. Arranging the skulls of these extinct ape species from the smallest to the biggest, and adding some skulls of vanished human races to the series, evolutionists concocted the scenario of human evolution. The most important role of this scenario is given to the extinct ape species called Australopithecus. The first Australopithecus fossil was found in 1924 by a paleontologist named Raymond Dart. Since then, evolutionists argue that this ape species, the name of which means southern ape, is a man-like creature. However, when Australopithecus and chimpanzee skeletons are compared, it is seen that there is no important difference between the two. In the face of this fact, evolutionists hypothesized that Australopithecus walked upright on its 2 feet differently from other apes. However, two world-renowned anatomists, Lord Solly Zuckerman and Professor Charles Oxnard, refuted this allegation. Simply put, Australopithecus, advanced as the ancestor of man by evolutionists, is merely an extinct ape species. On the other hand, fossils that are included by evolutionists under imaginary classifications, such as Homo erectus, Homo ergaster, or Homo sapien archaic, in fact belong to different human races. When these fossils are inspected, it is seen that their skeletons are essentially the same as those of people living today. The only dissimilarities are a few structural differences in their skulls. But differences like these are to be found in different human races alive on Earth today. The famous evolutionist paleontologist Richard Leakey admits that the difference between the skulls classified as Homo erectus and those of modern men is only racial. These differences are probably no more pronounced than we see today between the separate geographical races of modern humans. The only defense left to evolutionists against all these scientific facts is just one thing: propaganda. The baseless scenario of the human evolution is imposed on the public by means of imaginary drawings that appear in evolutionist publications. In these drawings, creatures with hairy bodies and simian features are decked out with overtones of human-like motifs. The given impression is that these half-man, half-ape transitional forms did live once. From time to time, drawings that present snapshots snapshots from the social life of these creatures are made. These misleading drawings are introduced in a particular sequence to engrave the scenario of the human evolution on the subconscious of society. Even in the most famous scientific publications, there frequently appear such window dressings called reconstructions and imaginary family tree drawings made by their inspiration. The imaginative power of evolutionists is not limited to fictional drawings and models. They go even further and shoot movies in which imaginary half-man, half-ape creatures act. However, all of these are pure deception. The only evidence at hand is generally nothing more than a few skull fragments or a tibia. The hair, skin, nose, ears, lips, or other facial features of a living being cannot be determined from its bone remains. Evolutionists shape these soft tissues, which leave no trace in the fossil, to suit the purposes of their theory, and produce imaginary reconstructions in their workshops. Ernest Houghton from Harvard University states that these drawings have no scientific value. You can, with equal facility, model on a Neanderthaloid skull the features of a chimpanzee or the lineaments of a philosopher. These alleged restorations of ancient types of man have very little, if any, scientific value and are likely only to mislead the public. Evolutionists go so far in this subject that they can even invent very different faces for the same skull. The three entirely different reconstructions made for the fossil called Zinjanthropus is a famous example showing how persistent evolutionists are in producing these false masks. Evolutionists engage not only in drawing and modeling tricks, sometimes they commit deliberate forgeries. The most famous of these frauds is the Piltdown fossil, introduced in England in 1912 by an evolutionist named Charles Dawson. This fossil was presented as the most important transitional form between ape and man and was displayed in museums for more than 30 years. Experts who re-examined the fossil in 1949 discovered that it was a forgery that had been produced by attaching an orangutan's jaw to a human skull. Another intermediate transitional form fabricated by evolutionists was the Nebraska man. This was cooked up in 1922 on the basis of a single fossil tooth. The evolutionists did not neglect to give it an ostentatious Latin name, Asparapithecus haroldcooki, or to make imaginary drawings related to it. It was soon revealed that the tooth that had been the source of inspiration for Nebraska Man, in fact, belonged to a wild pig. Many other fossil skulls have been presented as great evidence for evolution failed one by one. Neanderthal man was advanced as evidence in 1856, dismissed in 1960. Piltdown man was advanced as evidence in 1912, dismissed in 1953. Zinjanthropus was advanced as evidence in 1959, dismissed in 1960. Ramapithecus was advanced as evidence in 1964, dismissed in 1979. Despite all these facts, these skulls are still presented to the public through the media and in some evolutionist textbooks as if they were scientific facts. In many countries, an important part of the society supposes that evolution is a proven fact. A great deal of this so-called evidence of evolution, much of which has been dismissed by evolutionists themselves, is still presented to school children in their textbooks, where they are depicted as the ancestors of man. In fact, the truth that the evolutionists try so hard to deny and conceal is there for all to see. Species appeared all of a sudden and perfectly on the earth. That is, they were created. The divine creator, ruling over the whole of nature, created all kinds with their unique and perfect traits. The one and only God. He is the Lord of the heavens, the earth, and all that is between them.
Can you think of any observable evidence for Darwinian evolution where he said there'd be a change of kinds?
Monkey to man, is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, a change of kinds.
I don't really believe there's any proof for that yet.
Well, monkeys are the only ones with the fifth digit, like we have.
Well, koalas have a fifth digit. Did you know that?
I didn't know that.
Think we're evolved from koalas?
No.
When I went to Washington D.C., I saw they had a whole exhibit just on the...
In the Smithsonian?
Yeah, in the Smithsonian.
Oh wait, so that is just like some stuffed dummies, like standing around a fire.
I know that everyone talks about the missing link for humans and whatnot. I believe that there are connections that are out there that we haven't found yet.
I'm going to trust what those experts did.
The scientific method must be observable and repeatable. So could you give me one piece of observable evidence for Darwinian evolution?
Okay, I would point to, as one great example is look at the genetics of the stickleback.
What's that?
So stickleback fish are a very interesting collection of species that were recently isolated after the end of the Ice Age.
What did they become?
They're various species of sticklebacks.
They stayed as fish?
Well, of course.
Can you think of any observable evidence where there was a change of kinds?
Fish.
Human beings are still fish.
Human beings are fish?
Why, yes, of course they are.
How long did that take?
A couple billions of years, millions.
A couple of millions? How is that observable?
It's not.
We came out of the ground as a mammal, and one mammal created...
Come out of the ground? Didn't we come out of the sea?
Huh? Well, initially in the beginning, we came out of the ground and the sea. After the great destruction of the...
So did we have lungs or gills when we came out of the sea?
You want to know something? those that were in the sea, I guess, had gills, and those that were on land had lungs.
But if we came out of the sea, we had gills in the sea.
You want to know something? Who knows that we came out of the sea or we evolved from mammals?
So you don't know?
Huh? Of course I don't know.
I'm accepting that they did their science correctly.
Could you give me an example of Darwinian evolution, not adaptation or speciation, but a change of kinds?
These are changes of kinds.
They're still fish.
They're distinctly different fish.
We have thousands of examples.
Can you give me one?
I can give you thousands.
Just one.
For instance, I would say look at Lenski's experiments with bacteria then.
So what do the bacteria become?
The bacteria are still bacteria, of course.
So that's not Darwinian evolution. That's not a change of kinds, is it?
It is a change. It is a change in the genetic makeup of the bacteria, which is
still bacteria. So what do the bacteria become?
A new kind of bacteria.
So it's still bacteria. There's no change of kinds. To summarize, the observable evidence that you give me for Darwinian evolution is bacteria becoming bacteria.
No, it is bacteria acquiring new metabolic capabilities.
When you say change of kinds, you mean the evolution of one species from another or to another? Yes, we have that in action actually in the Galapagos.
Could you give me one instance?
Yes, we have an example from a group of birds called Darwin's finches.
You take a look at the difference between the finches on the islands that all started out. I mean, that's very, very observable.
But that's not Darwinian evolution. There's been no change of kinds. What do the finches become?
They become genetically new and anatomically new, recognizably different species.
So they're still finches?
Well, of course they're still finches, yes.
So they're not a change of, there's no change of kind.
Little birds that he had observed that...
What did they become?
Their beaks, their beak shapes.
They're still birds?
Yes. 3 finches that turn into different types of birds.
They're still finches?
Well, for example, Darwin and his study on evolution of the birds on the island that he went on to there.
Their beaks changed?
Their beaks...
they're still birds. There's no change of kinds. That's within the kind.
Just evolution on the beaks.
So that's called adaptation. It's not Darwinian evolution. There's no change of kinds. There's no different animal involved. I want something that shows me Darwin's belief in a change of kinds is scientific. Darwin spoke of a change of kind. Can you think of any observable evidence for Darwinian evolution where there's a change of kind?
Change of kind. Change of kind. I'm gonna have to think about that one a little longer.
You give me anything that I can see, observe, and test, which is a scientific method for Darwinian evolution, a change of kinds.
Test and observe.
Could you give me observable evidence, which is a scientific method for Darwinian evolution, a change of kinds?
I gotta think about it. So you want the evidence of it?
I would say...
I cannot, I think. It's a hard question, actually. Mitochondrial DNA. So, can you repeat the question again?
Could you give me any observable evidence, just one, for Darwinian evolution?
Let me think about that for a sec.
Observable evidence, something where we don't have to exercise faith. Something that can be observed, like the scientific process, observable?
That's a good question. That one I'm not quite sure.
So you can't think of any observable evidence for evolution?
No.
How do you know it's true?
I'm not sure.
So Darwinian evolution is not observable, it's not scientific.
I guess so.
So it's unscientific, you can't prove it.
It's scientific, actually. You could prove it. It could be proven, just...
Do it for me.
That's hard. that's just too broad of a.
It's unobservable. That's why you need millions of years.
Yes, exactly.
You're trusting the biology majors and the biology professors know what they're talking about, and they can't even give me evidence of a change of kinds.
Well, then there isn't one. If they don't give it, then I wouldn't say there was.
Yeah. I just go on what I've seen and what I've learned from class.
So you believe?
Yeah.
You know what that's called?
What?
Blind faith.
Blind faith.
Faith is the great cop-out, the great excuse to evade the need to think and evaluate evidence. Richard Dawkins.
If I asked you to explain how computers came to be, but you cannot use man as your answer, I only want a purely naturalistic explanation for the origin of computers. Purely naturalistic. The answer has to lie within the computer. How did these molecules get together? How did this data get together? How did these plastic molecules come together and the different silicone chips? How did it happen? Your answer has to lie in the computer. I've already eliminated the only obvious answer to the problem at the beginning by my definition. They're trying to eliminate the only logical answer to the question by their definition of science. They want to define science as things that we can observe and test and demonstrate in the natural world. Okay, well then that eliminates both evolution and creation. Both are unobserved. We don't see anything change. We don't see anything created from nothing. Here's the problem. Both creation and evolution are religious. I admit mine's a religion. They don't admit theirs is a religion. And all of us are paying for their religion to be taught in the school system. And I, for one, resent that. So my answer is still the same. God did it.
It's happening. We are losing our freedom in one of the most important sectors of society, science. I have always assumed that scientists were free to ask any question, to pursue any line of inquiry without fear of reprisal. But recently, I've been alarmed to discover that this is not the case. It all began when I met evolutionary biologist Richard Sternberg in Washington, D.C. His life was nearly ruined when he strayed from the party line while serving as editor of a scientific journal affiliated with the prestigious Smithsonian Museum of Natural History. Your office was over there?
That's correct. This here is the West Wing. Directly ahead of us is the West Wing of the Natural History Museum.
So now you're not there anymore because you're a bad boy.
No, I'm not. No, I was exiled.
You're a bad boy. You question the powers that be. What was Dr. Sternberg's crime? He dared to publish an article by Dr. Stephen Meyer, one of the leading lights of the intelligent design movement. The paper ignited a firestorm of controversy merely because it suggested intelligent design might be able to explain how life began. As a result, Dr. Sternberg lost his office, his political and religious beliefs were investigated, and he was pressured to resign.
The questioning of Darwinism was a bridge too far for many. The mentioning of intelligent design that occurs at the end of the paper was over the top. And I think the intelligent design proponents have raised a number of very important questions.
And you wanted to get those questions brought up and discussed.
Placed on the table.
Placed on the table.
People were so upset about it. They were so upset that you could see they had a physical, emotional reaction.
Wow.
They were saying that Stephen C. Meyer is a well-known Christian, that Stephen C. Meyer is an intelligent design proponent, that Stephen C. Meyer is a Republican. It was all couched in terms of religion, politics, and sociology. The way the chair of the department put it is that I was viewed as an intellectual terrorist.
Terrorist?
Because of giving the topic of intelligent design some modicum of credibility.
What happened to Dr. Sternberg was terrible, but surely it was just an isolated case. I was still pretty skeptical, so naturally I checked in with the head of the Skeptics Society, Michael Shermer.
So I can't prove there is no God or Yahweh in your case, any more than I can prove there is no Isis, Zeus, Apollo, Brahma, Ganesha, Mithras, Allah, or for that matter, the flying spaghetti monster. And think about just one thing. Why would the aliens look like this?
Well,
these are bipedal.
Who drew that?
Skepticism It's not a position you take. It's just an approach to claims.
This one is called the borderlands of science, where sense meets nonsense. Is intelligent design nonsense?
Well, it's unproven. So in that sense, it's nonsense. So I would put it in the sort of shaded areas between good, solid science and total nonsense. You know, it's sort of 3/4 of the way toward the nonsense side.
But you think, nevertheless, people should be allowed to speak about it and publish papers about it?
They are free to write and publish and be heard in public forums and go to conferences just like everybody else does.
Well, what if a person published something, say at the Smithsonian, in favor of intelligent design and then lost his job over it? And it had been peer-reviewed, and published, and then he lost his job over it anyway. What would happen? What do you think about that situation?
I think that particular situation, there was something else going on.
What was going on?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know because I don't know. But I think there had to be something. People don't get fired over something like that. You roll up your sleeves, you get to work, you do the research, you get your grants, you get your data, you publish, and you work your butt off, and that's how you get your theories taught.
Well, but wait a minute. What if you try and roll up your sleeves and go to work and work your butt off, and they say, well, we're going to fire you if you even mention the word intelligent design?
I don't think that's happening. Where is that happening?
George Mason University. Throughout its 50-year history, our mission has remained clear: to prepare a diverse population of students to think and to grow in a climate of unbridled academic freedom.
After Dr. Caroline Crocker simply mentioned intelligent design in her cell biology class at George Mason University, her promising academic career came to an abrupt end.
My supervisor invited me into his office. He said, "I'm going to have to discipline you for teaching creationism." And I said, I mentioned intelligent design on a couple of slides, but I did not teach creationism. He said, "Nonetheless, you have to be disciplined." At the end of the semester, I lost my job.
Not only did this well-loved professor lose her job at George Mason, she suddenly found herself blacklisted, unable to find a job anywhere.
So whenever I interviewed for a job, I would be offered it, usually on the spot. Since this has happened, and since people can Google my name, I'm finding that when I send my credentials, I do get interviews, I get many interviews, but I never get offered a job. I don't tell them about my science sin. I was only trying to teach what the university stands for, which is academic freedom.
There's nothing to be learned in neurosurgery by assuming an accidental origin for the parts of the brain that we work on.
It wasn't just biologists who were feeling the Darwinist wrath. When neurosurgeon Michael Egnor wrote an essay to high school students saying doctors didn't need to study evolution in order to practice medicine, the Darwinists were quick to try and exterminate this new threat.
A lot of people on a lot of blogs called me unprintable names that were printed. There are a lot of very, very nasty comments. Other people suggested that people call the university I work at and suggested perhaps it's time for me to retire. I realized when I kind of went public with my doubts about the adequacy of Darwin's theory that I would encounter criticism. What has amazed me is the viciousness and the sort of baseness of it.
I'm an old guy. I have tenure. I'm academically safe. But the young people and what is happening to them in America right now because of this scientism gulag is really terrible.
Apparently, Professor Marks was not as safe as he thought. A few months after this interview, Baylor University shut down his research website and forced him to return grant money once they discovered a link between his work and intelligent design.
In order to attract grants, you have to market yourself. So you put up sites and call yourself labs and groups and things like that in order to get visibility. And in my entire experience in academia, I never went to any superior and asked them any permission to put up any of these labs. So the fact that this was singled out, let alone shut down, is jaw-dropping. It's astonishing. I have never been treated like this in my about 30 years in academia.
Shut up, you freak! I said shut up! It's a madhouse!
If you peel back the onion I think that there is no doubt that the center of this is my work in what some would call intelligent design.
People really get emotional about this. Whenever you say intelligent design in a room of academics, them's fighting words.
Creationists. Astronomer Guillermo Gonzalez found himself in a fierce shootout with Iowa State University following the publication of his book, arguing that the universe is intelligently designed. Despite a stellar research record that has led to the discovery of several planets, his application for tenure was denied, putting his career in jeopardy.
I worried about my tenure a little bit in 2005 when the petition was being circulated because I viewed that as a strategy of Hector Avalos and his associates to try to poison the atmosphere on campus against me because he knew I wasn't tenured yet and I was very vulnerable. I have little doubt that I would have tenure now if I hadn't done any professional work on intelligent design.
Dr. Gonzalez had this advice for scientists who might be thinking about following his example.
If they value their careers, they should keep quiet about their intelligent design views.
We know there are times and places to be quiet, and other times and places when we can make noise if we want to.
Will you show us?
Of course. Boys and girls, how would you like to show some of the ways we know of being quiet?
It's the kind of thing where you just learn to keep your mouth shut.
In addition to those scientists who were willing to appear on camera, we encountered many more who didn't dare show their face for fear of losing their jobs.
You use an intelligent design perspective to get the research done, but you're not allowed to talk about it in public.
And so there is definitely incentive, if you think about it, for people to remain within the mainstream.
You know, what's he up to? What is he thinking? Is he one of them? That kind of thing.
If I write intelligent design, they hear creationism. They hear religious right. They hear theocracy.
So it appears Mr. Shermer, the self-styled skeptic, was wrong on this one. Intelligent design was being suppressed in a systematic and ruthless fashion.
Evolution is, from an intelligent design perspective, is perfectly acceptable if the sense is that how did the design get implemented? The issue is there real design there, and are these material mechanisms like natural selection, are these adequate to account for everything we see in biology? And our argument is no, it's not.
But Darwin produced all this evidence from his travels and his studies at the Galapagos that evolution explained things.
If you look at the history of science, people often have a good idea and then they decide just to run with it. And they say, we're going to apply this everywhere. And so Darwin takes his idea of natural selection and says, I'm going to explain all of life with it. I mean, physics used to be Newtonian physics. Newton was physics. And then we got to look to Einstein, general relativity. It's not, Newton isn't enough. Well, I think likewise what we're finding with Darwin is that he had some valid insights, but it's not the whole picture.
Okay, Darwinism may not be the complete picture, but what made these guys think they had the missing pieces? I put this question to Dr. Stephen Meyer, author of the paper that originally got Dr. Sternberg in so much trouble. Newton is buried in the geniuses corner at Westminster Abbey, right?
That's correct, yeah. Darwin is also buried in Westminster Abbey.
Right, and so is Darwin, right near each other, right? And you're here in Redmond in a little building without a sign, right? And you're obviously an incredibly smart guy, but how dare you challenge someone who's buried in the geniuses corner next to Newton at Westminster Abbey?
Well, it may seem a little cheeky, but it's what scientists are supposed to do. When I was in Cambridge, one of my supervisors often advised us to beware the sound of one hand clapping, which was a way of saying if there's an argument on one side, there's bound to be an argument on the other. And what I found in studying the structure of the argument in The Origin of Species is that for every evidence-based argument for one of Darwin's two key propositions, there is an evidence-based counter-argument.
Well, but is it a debate? I mean, there's just you and a couple of other guys in a dinky little office downtown, say on one side, and there's the faculties of all the great universities of the world on the other side.
Speaking with a great uniform and authoritative voice.
Right.
Yeah. Well, in any case, the debate really isn't going to be settled by numbers. It's going to be settled by the evidence and the arguments.
While I was still in Bill Gates country, Dr. Meyer recommended I check in with molecular biologist Jonathan Wells. What kind of names do they call you?
Creationist.
What do you say back to them when they say you're a creationist?
Well, I usually don't get the opportunity.
What's at stake for you personally here?
First of all, I love science. I think the way Darwinism corrupts the evidence, distorts the evidence, is bad for science.
Well, the other scientists would tell you to just shut up if you love science, okay? Because you're sort of being a bomb thrower into science.
I am upsetting the apple cart, and I think it deserves to be upset in this case.
Why?
Because the evidence is being distorted to prop up a theory that I think doesn't fit it.
Was Darwinism really that bad? Perhaps a change of scenery would give me a fresh perspective. Merci, monsieur.
Ah, je vous en prie, monsieur.
Merci. Wow, this is fabulous.
Let's put it this way. Before you can ask, is Darwinian theory correct or not, you have to ask the preliminary question, is it clear enough so that it could be correct? That's a very different question. One of my prevailing doctrines about Darwinian theory is, man, that thing is just a mess. It's like looking into a room full of smoke. Nothing in the theory is precisely, clearly, carefully defined or delineated. It lacks all of the rigor one expects from mathematical physics, and mathematical physics lacks all of the rigor one expects from mathematics. So we're talking about a gradual descent down the level of intelligibility until we reach evolutionary biology. We don't even know what a species is, for heaven's sakes.
So his theory is smoke, but elegant smoke.
There's a certain elegance to it, but you know, I think Einstein had the appropriate remark. He preferred to leave elegance to his tailor.
A room full of smoke? That certainly wasn't what I was hearing from prominent Darwinists like Richard Dawkins.
Evolution is a fact. It's a fact which is established as securely as essentially any other fact that we have in science.
Richard Dawkins is so confident that evolution is a fact, and that therefore God doesn't exist, that he has devoted his entire life to spreading the evolution gospel.
I'm an atheist with respect to the Judeo-Christian God because there is not a shred of evidence in favor of the Judeo-Christian God. It is completely right to say that since the evidence for evolution is so absolutely, totally overwhelming, nobody who looks at it could possibly doubt that if they were sane and not stupid. So the only remaining possibility is that they're ignorant, and most people who don't believe in evolution are indeed ignorant.
But the people I spoke with weren't ignorant. They were highly credentialed scientists. So there had to be something else going on here. So you think the whole theory of evolution is false, or just certain parts of it?
Well, again, evolution is a slippery word. I would say minor changes within species happen. But Darwin didn't write a book called How Existing Species Change Over Time. He wrote a book called The Origin of Species. He purported to show how this same process leads to new species, in fact, every species. And the evidence for that grand claim is, in my opinion, almost totally lacking.
How does Darwin or Darwinism say life began?
Well, he didn't know, and in fact, nobody knows. So Darwinism, strictly defined, starts after the origin of life and deals only with living things.
Well, how can there be a theory about life without a theory about how life began?
Well, a grand overarching evolutionary story, of course, does include the origin of life, but Darwin's theory doesn't begin until you have the first cell.
Well, does someone have a theory about how life began?
This is the story of a small planet in space called Earth.
For a typical Darwinian explanation of how life originated, Dr. Wells directed me toward this documentary.
The chemical elements essential for life, hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, and nitrogen, were now in place. What was needed was a way of combining them. Perhaps the energy came from lightning. Whatever it was.
Excuse me?
Whatever it was, energy managed to arrange these chemical ingredients in just the right way.
Whatever it was? I was hoping for something a little more scientific. The most popular idea has been that life emerged spontaneously from primordial soup. In 1953, Stanley Miller mixed water, methane, ammonia, and hydrogen to simulate the early Earth's atmosphere. Then he ran electricity through it in an attempt to jumpstart life.
It's alive! It's alive!
it didn't work. While the initial results seemed promising, 50 years later, most serious scientists have abandoned this approach in favor of alternate theories. What were the chances of life arising on its own?
It's been speculated that probably there would have to be a minimum of about 250 proteins to provide minimal life function. If that's really true, then I think it's almost inconceivable that life could have happened in some simple step-by-step way.
Okay, so the simplest form of life requires at least 250 proteins to function. What's so difficult about that?
We're talking about something that's staggeringly improbable, roughly 1 in a trillion.
Let all of life choose a million, a trillion. The number is essentially zero. Something has to skew nature to choose the ones that work.
So, in the game of life, it looks as if the house always wins. Luckily, some serious scientific minds have figured out a way to beat the odds.
Directed panspermia.
When faced with the overwhelming problem of the origin of life, Nobel Prize winner Francis Crick proposed this theory, that life was seeded on Earth, which basically means aliens did it. Crystals? Aliens? I thought we were talking about science, not science fiction.
We don't know what caused life to arise. Did it arise by a purely undirected process? Or did it arise by some kind of intelligent guidance or design? And the rules of science are being applied to actually foreclose one of the two possible answers to that very fundamental and basic and important question.
So the rules of science say we will consider any possibility except one that is guided.
Exactly.
No matter how life began, on the backs of crystals or in the test tube of some intelligent designer, everyone agrees it started with a single cell. But what is a cell? Let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
Darwin wrote The Origin of Species in 1859, published it in 1859. He had an idea of the cell as being quite simple, correct?
Yeah, everybody did.
Okay. If he thought of the cell as being a Buick, what is the cell now in terms of its complexity by comparison?
A galaxy.
If Darwin thought a cell was, say, a mud hut, what do we now know that a cell is?
More complicated than a Saturn V.
So what is in a cell as far as we know now?
A world that Darwin never could have imagined.
I needed someone who could give me a glimpse into this world. So we went to molecular biologist Doug Axe.
Think of a cell as being a nanofactory, a factory where on a very small scale, digital instructions are being used to make the components of the factory. Here we have the famous DNA double helix. You can see the two helical strands that are intertwined and wind around each other on the outside of the molecule. This is the material that stores all of our genetic information. In higher life forms, this will be the equivalent of something like a gigabyte of information stored in the molecules that form the individual chromosomes, all packed within the nucleus, which is a tiny fraction of the entire cell size. So what does DNA do? Well, the information in DNA ends up providing the information for sequencing the amino acids to make protein. We have information in a one-dimensional form that provides the information for a three-dimensional form.
The cell really is like nothing we've ever seen in the physical world. That's got to be firmly grasped. That's not something we can just say, oh, well, it's just a little bit more of the same old, same old. It's not the same old, same old.
We are finding is that there's information that's in the cell that cannot be accounted for in terms of these undirected material causes. So these,
it has to be.
And so there's some other. So it has to be an information source.
So one of the key questions faced by modern biology is, where do you get information from?
Well, Darwin assumed that the increase in information comes from natural selection. But natural selection reduces genetic information, and we know this from all the genetic population studies that we have.
And where does the new genetic information going to come from?
Well, that's the big question.
So when we find information in the DNA molecule The most likely explanation is that it too had an intelligent source.
I mean, we need engineering principles to understand these systems, okay? I mean, it's only because of our advancements in nanotechnology that we can even begin to appreciate these systems.
But using intelligent design didn't seem to stop the scientists I spoke with, so why all the controversy?
Suppose we find, simply as a matter of fact, that our scientific inquiries point in one direction.
Which is that there is an intelligent creator.
Why should we eliminate that from discussion? Streng verboten? How come? Why?
Streng verboten. Very good. What does streng verboten mean? Strongly forbidden.
Strongly forbidden.
You've got two possible hypotheses. You've got a wall through the middle of through your brain, in effect, through your thinking. You say, well, you can't consider anything on this side of the wall. Only hypotheses on this side of the wall are permissible for consideration.
What about academic freedom? I mean, can't we just talk about this?
Their reply is that science is not a democratic process.
Oh, really?
And that there is a consensus view.
But wait a minute,
we are to subscribe to the
wait a second,
view.
but Darwin challenged the consensus view, and that's how we got Darwinism. If Darwin wanted to challenge the consensus today, how would he do it? Science isn't a hobby for rich aristocrats anymore. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. And if you want a piece of the pie, you've got to be a good comrade.
Scientific ideas. How we get them to you, the people. Every idea must be inspected to ensure that it is safe. All theories must pass through a series of checkpoints. First, the Academy.
Getting a controversial theory through the Academy can be dangerous. Few people know this better than Congressman Mark Souder. He uncovered a targeted campaign led by individuals within the Smithsonian and the National Center for Science Education to destroy Dr. Sternberg's credibility.
If you want peer reviews, if you want to be published, if you want to go to respected institutions, the core view does not tolerate dissent. There's kind of a, this is the way it is, and anybody who's a dissenter should be squashed.
Are you going to be on my side if I let you up?
Sure, Tick, sure. I'm on your side. Just let me up. I'll do anything you say.
Souder isn't the only one who has witnessed the Academy's tactics. Journalist Larry Witham has seen similar behavior during his 25 years of covering the evolution controversy.
Once you're thick in science, you can't question the paradigm. But if you want to get grants, if you want to be elected to high positions, if you want to get awards as a promoter of public education of science, you can't question the paradigm.
People cannot be trusted to form their own opinions. This business about open-mindedness is nonsense.
Why is the scientific establishment so afraid of free speech?
There is this fear that if one aspect of the theory is closely scrutinized, there's going to be an unraveling.
Who are you?
Oh, I am the great and powerful Wizard of Oz.
I interviewed dozens and dozens of scientists, and when they're amongst each other or talking to a journalist who they trust, they'll speak about, it's incredibly complex, or molecular biology is in a crisis. But publicly, they can't say that.
Keeping a keen eye on the Academy, our various watchdog organizations.
Listen to Eugenie Scott of the National Center for Science Education. The NCSE has been at the heart of virtually every evolution controversy over the past 25 years, vigorously defending the Darwinian gospel.
NCSE was started by a group of scientists and teachers who were very concerned because in the late 70s and early 80s there were a lot of attempts to pass equal time for creation science and evolution laws. And clearly this is something that neither scientists nor teachers liked. It wasn't exactly help the creationists are coming, but it's, kind of along those lines. Most scientists just throw up their hands and say, creationists, they drive me crazy, you handle it. We've worked a lot with science education organizations. The most important group we work with is members of the faith community, because the best kept secret in this controversy is that Catholics and mainstream Protestants are okay on evolution.
Are you sure about that, Eugenie?
Liberal Christians have been fighting with conservative Christians for so long that they'll side with anybody against the fundamentalists. And Eugenie Scott says, well, welcome over.
Working hard to keep ideas in check are our friends in the media.
Morning, paper. Paper, mister?
The tendency of the media is to side with the establishment because they inherently agree with the establishment.
Eugenie Scott, my understanding is that there is not a single peer-reviewed article out there that supports intelligent design. Am I wrong?
You are not wrong. You are correct.
I believe that we get coverage, but we always get coverage like we're the outsider, not like it's an even debate.
But instead of merely reporting news, he analyzes it, often expressing his personal opinions.
We constantly deal with reporters who refuse even to report the correct definition of intelligent design. They, over and over again, talk about life is so complex, God must have done it.
Just admit it, it's religion.
Very simple.
You just can't, it's religion.
It's a wanton distortion of our position.
Study desk.
I've got a hot story here. You can look at Associated Press stories, and the same sentence will appear in those stories for 10 years. Intelligent design says that life is too complex. It's called a boilerplate. And the reporter never reports anymore or gets any new ways to say it, so the public understanding never advances.
But what happens if a reporter decides to take a more balanced approach to intelligent design?
There might be remarkable pressure on that reporter not to side against the evolutionists.
I thought I told you to kill that story.
Few reporters have learned this better than author and journalist Pamela Winnick. When she refused to take sides in an article she wrote about intelligent design, the Darwinists found a new favorite target.
Number one, I wasn't Christian, I was Jewish. Number two, I wasn't religious. Number three, I was not taking a position in favor of creationism. I was writing about intelligent design, and it didn't matter. After I wrote that one piece, everything I wrote on the subject was scrutinized. There were hate letters coming into the newspaper. If you give any credence to it whatsoever, which means just writing about it, you are just finished as a journalist.
Other journalists we spoke with told similar stories, but didn't dare appear on camera.
And now, the presses are ready to roll.
When all other checkpoints fail, there is always the courts.
We have spent an enormous amount of time trying to prove to the court what everybody already knows, that intelligent design is a particular religious belief.
But I thought scientific questions were settled by the evidence, not by taking people to court and suing them. How do other countries deal with such disputes? Dr. Marcy Giertuk, a population geneticist who now represents Poland in the European Parliament, was able to shed some light on this topic.
The censorship of teaching criticism of evolution is and always was much stronger in, say, in your country, in the United States, than it ever was in Poland.
Why? Why would the censorship?
That is because you have a political correctness in your country. These issues are brought to court, and the court says what you can and what you cannot teach.
We want to know what you teach, what books you use, how you teach it.
We never had that sort of way of deciding scientific issues in Poland. We never had the courts involved.
So you are saying that as far as the teaching of science is concerned, Poland is freer academically than the United States?
I think in this particular issue of evolution, I think this is true.
But how effective are the courts in deciding such matters?
What about the general idea that intelligent design is doomed as a result of several recent legal setbacks?
I think court cases don't decide anything. I mean, if you look at the Scopes trial, who won that trial? It wasn't the evolutionists. I mean, it was the Tennessee law was upheld, barring evolution. And yet, in the popular imagination, Scopes is the hero. Inherit the Wind, that movie, which is really bogus history based on the Scopes trial, has carried the day. These issues go much deeper than any decision by a judge.
The evolution debate does seem to run much deeper than the courts, much deeper even than science. To generate this level of hostility, ID must threaten something at the very core of the Darwinian establishment. Oxford professor Alistair McGrath, author of The Dawkins Delusion, seemed like the ideal person to answer my question.
Richard Dawkins has a charming and very, I think,
interesting view of the relationship between science and religion. They're at war with each other, and in the end, one's got to win, and it's going to be science. It's a very naive view. It's based on a complete historical misrepresentation of the way science and religion have interacted. Dawkins seems to think that a scientific description is an anti-religious argument. Describing how something happens scientifically somehow explains it away. It doesn't. But the questions of purpose, intentionality, the question why, still remain there on the table.
And I think it was just a catastrophic mistake to have someone like Dawkins address himself to profound issues of theology, the existence of God, the nature of life. He hasn't committed himself to disciplined study in any relevant area of inquiry. He's a crummy philosopher. He doesn't have the rudimentary skills to meticulously assess his own arguments.
Genius guy, though.
Very smart guy. A little bit of a reptile, but a very smart guy.
The founders of early modern science, Sir Isaac Newton, Robert Boyle, Johannes Kepler, Galileo, most of these early scientists all not only believed in God, but they thought their belief in God actually made it easier to do science.
You can be religiously motivated and you can do good science. And they have more often gone together than not gone together.
Admitting our biases is the best way towards rational discussion, which I would welcome.
Rational debate is a nice thought, but it's nearly impossible in the current climate. I'd seen the chilling effect that this unquestioning devotion to Darwinism has had on science. What other societies have used Darwinism to trump all other authorities, including religion? As a Jew, my mind leapt to one regime in particular.
The connection between Hitler and Darwin is, of course, historically a difficult connection because they were separated by a good many years. One was English, one was German. Nonetheless, if you open Mein Kampf and read it, especially if you can read it in German, the correspondence between Darwinian ideas and Nazi ideas just leaps from the page. Of course, you have to add every historical caution. Not everyone who read Darwin became a Nazi. Obviously not. No one is making that case. Darwinism is not a sufficient condition for a phenomenon like Nazism, but I think it's certainly a necessary one.
Go ahead. All right, your question, where did God come from, assumes that you're thinking of the wrong, obviously it displays that you're thinking of the wrong God, because the God of the Bible is not affected by time, space, or matter. If he's affected by time, space, or matter, he's not God. Time, space, and matter is what we call a continuum. All of them have to come into existence at the same instant, because if there were matter but no space, where would you put it? If there were matter and space but no time, when would you put it? You cannot have time, space, or matter independently. They have to come into existence simultaneously. The Bible answers that in 10 words. In the beginning, there's time. God created the heaven, there's space, and the earth, there's matter. So you have time, space, matter, created a trinity of trinities there. Just, time is past, present, future. Space has length, width, height. Matter has solid, liquid, gas. You have a trinity of trinities created instantaneously. And the God who created them has to be outside of them. If he's limited by time, he's not God. The guy who created this computer is not in the computer. He's not running around in there changing the numbers on the screen, okay? The God who created this universe is outside of the universe. He's above it, beyond it, in it, through it. He's unaffected by it. So the concept that a spiritual force cannot have any effect on a material body, well then I guess you'd have to explain to me things like emotions and love and hatred and envy and jealousy and rationality. I mean, if your brain is just a random collection of chemicals that formed by chance over billions of years, how on earth can you trust your own reasoning processes and the thoughts that you think? Okay, so your question, where did God come from, is assuming a limited God. And that's your problem. The God that I worship is not limited by time, space, or matter. If I could fit the infinite God in my 3-pound brain, he would not be worth worshiping, that's for certain. So that's the God that I worship. Thank you.
Are you a good person? Are you going to make it to heaven?
I would like to think so.
Do I think I'm a good person? Yeah. Are you a good person, morally?
Yes, I am.
Do you think you're a good person?
Yes.
I like to believe so, yeah. How many lies have you told in your whole life?
I wouldn't be able to count. I don't know if I could remember.
Can you be honest with me? Yeah. How many lies do you think you've told in your whole life?
Oh, quite a few.
Countless.
Uncountable.
What would you call me if I told lots of lies? Countless lies. You'd call me a liar, wouldn't you?
Of course.
What do you call someone who's told thousands of lies?
A liar?
So what are you?
I'm a liar.
Have you ever stolen something in your whole life, even if it's small?
Yes, I have.
Have you ever taken something that belonged to someone else?
Of course.
Sure.
Yes, I have.
That's called theft. So what are you?
A liar and a thief. I'm a liar and a thief.
Have you ever used God's name in vain?
Oh, every day.
Have you ever used God's name in vain?
Oh, all the time.
Have you ever used God's name in vain?
It's probably so.
Have you ever used God's name in vain?
Yep. I have indeed.
It's called blasphemy. It's very serious to use God's name as a cuss word.
I don't believe in blaspheming since I don't believe in God. So if you don't believe in God, how can you blaspheme?
Well, if I don't believe in certain laws and still violate them, ignorance of the law is no excuse. So we're still guilty even though we deny a law exists or we even don't know about it. One to go, and I appreciate your honesty, Jacob. Jesus said if you look at a woman and lust for her, you commit adultery with her in your heart. Have you ever looked at a woman with lust?
Why, yes, I look at many women with lust in my heart.
Of course. Have you ever looked at a guy with lust?
With lust?
Lust.
Oh, yeah.
Sure.
Not recently.
I have indeed.
Are you having sex outside of marriage?
No, not yet.
Are you looking at pornography?
Yes.
You're lusting after women, see?
Of course.
Have you ever looked at a woman with lust?
Absolutely.
So, Peter, by your own admission, you're a lying thief, a blasphemer, and an adulterer at heart. And that's only 4 of the 10 commandments. What I'm saying to you is just not believing in hell doesn't make it go away. A judge must see that justice is done if he's a good judge, and it's the same with God. If we die in our sins, God will give us justice. The Bible says no thief, no liar, no fornicator, no blasphemer, no adulterer will inherit the kingdom of God. So, Julia, if you died in your sins and God gave you justice because he's holy and perfect morally, you'd end up in hell, and I'd hate that to happen to you. Man, would you sell one of your eyes for $1 million?
Probably not, no.
Both for $100 million?
No, I value seeing too much.
So see how precious your eyes are to you, how much more precious is your life. And you're saying, I don't care if I get damned from all that which is good. Of course you care. You've got a will to live.
Generally don't engage creationists because it's not good for my blood pressure.
CCTV footage in China shows this incredible moment. A man caught a baby who fell out of a 2-story building. Residents in Guangdong.
A neighbor of the family had opened the girl's coffin to adjust the body when he noticed a slight movement of her head. The girl was apparently pronounced dead 2 days earlier.
The story is spreading like wildfire. How Walter Williams woke up from the dead in Holmes County.
What happened, so they can call it a miracle.
An incredible story. Family and friends calling it a miracle. A 21-year-old U of A student wakes up from a coma after doctors nearly declared him brain dead.
Of a tornado hitting this hardware store in Louisiana last week. A FedEx driver tried to take shelter inside. The door was locked, so she hid behind a soda machine. It fell over. Look at that. My goodness, when the tornado destroyed the entire store. Incredibly, she was not injured. She walked away without a scratch.
This has carried the man to safety, and moments later,
Loud popping noises came from the car, a noise they say they won't forget. The driver was taken to Regional 1 in non-critical condition, but a sight that brought tears to many was this Bible, the only thing left in a completely burned up vehicle sitting on the front seat.
So that is God. So you don't believe?
And beautiful rescue, raising questions about the power of prayer. People are scouring nearly 70 photographs looking for some sign of a man they swear they saw at the scene of a car accident. He prayed, a life was saved. So why did he disappear, even from the photos? ABC's David Muir now on Faith and a Mystery tonight.
Jesús, fuera. Puedes agarrar la bolsa y no se la luz. Nosotros sanamos en nombre de Jesús.
Gracias, Gabriel, por estar aquí. Rafael, el doctor.
¿Todo bien?
Gracias.
Amen. Dude, she hasn't been able to walk. She has not been able to walk for 5 years, but she's still crying. Is that good? Yeah.
You kidding me? Gangrene? Is it?
Yeah, she had gangrene in her spine, in her knees, and in her back.
Best story of the night right here. A Michigan couple getting the shock of their lives when they got an alert from their security camera in the driveway.
It was kind of like really unusual. I've never ever seen anything like it.
I was like, wow. I mean, that is an angel.
The photos are exactly how they were taken. I choose to believe it. I think it's an angel.
Take a good look. Many, including their pastor, said that they believe this image, captured by a security camera, shows an angel hovering over the family's truck last week.
Yeah, well, so I read your book, and there's something that stuck out to me. How can anyone talk about historical evidence for the resurrection when the resurrection by nature is a miracle, right? We all know miracles can't be proven scientifically.
Correct, but we don't have to prove a miracle to prove a resurrection.
Okay, love to hear you explain that one.
No, you just have to show that Jesus died and he was seen afterwards.
Right, but the very people who claim that they saw him are religious zealots. So in my line of work, we call those biased sources.
Well, I'm not interested in bias either, Mr. Strobel. You see, I care about the facts for professional and personal reasons.
Right, so where are the facts, Dr. Habermas? The resurrection narrative is more legend than it is history.
Really? Well, not according to historical records. Did you know that we have a report of the resurrection with specific eyewitnesses that dates all the way back to within months of the resurrection itself? That source also adds that 500 separate people saw Jesus at the same time. We're not talking decades or centuries after the cross, Mr. Strobel. It's months.
Witnesses, but that's still just one historical source, the Bible.
Wrong. There are at least 9 ancient sources, both inside and outside the Bible, confirming that disciples and others encountered Jesus after the crucifixion.
But they were already followers of Jesus.
Well, not all of them. Think of Saul of Tarsus. He originally was a persecutor of Christians. He hunted them down and killed them. Yet he died the Apostle Paul, proclaiming that Jesus was the Son of God.
But let's not kid ourselves here. People die for lies all the time.
900 people died drinking poison Kool-Aid at Jonestown.
True, and there are other examples like that throughout history, but here's the difference. People don't willingly drink poison for something that they know is a lie.
Fair point.
If the early church martyrs knew that the resurrection was a hoax, then why would they willingly die for it? Would you?
Of course. I should tell you I'm a bit of a history buff myself, so yeah, I'm particularly intrigued with your archaeological work.
Former life.
Former life, yes. I'm a bit surprised, given your stellar reputation, that you just gave all that up for this.
Would you like to be more specific?
Well, it just seems to me that for the better part of 2,000 years, Christianity has been creating these rituals and these rules. You know, they've erected these elaborate and often expensive cathedrals, and all of that to support a faith that I believe is ultimately built on sand.
And yet, it's all still standing.
Yes, because people keep telling each other the same stories over and over again. Just because I write something down and I bury it in the dirt, that doesn't make it true.
I think I'm beginning to see the crux of your visit.
Look, I understand that a number of people claim to have seen Jesus after his crucifixion, and some of them even wrote it down. But I guess my question is, how can we be sure of the reliability of those manuscripts?
Well, the same way we authenticate any historical document, by comparing and contrasting the copies that have been recovered. It's called textual criticism. The more copies we have, the better that we can cross-reference and figure out if what the original was saying is historically accurate. And the earlier they come from in history, the better. Take Homer's Iliad, for example.
Is this real?
That's as real as the Macedonian dirt that I dug it up from.
Well, the Greeks considered this their Bible for many centuries.
Yes, they did. That is one of 1,565 copies in existence today. Now, the Iliad was originally composed 800 years before Christ.
Okay.
This Greek copy is dated at the 3rd century AD.
So, 800, so that's 1,100 years between this copy and the original, yes?
Correct. There is only one ancient collection of writings that has more authenticated copies than the Iliad. Can you guess what that is?
You're going to tell me the Bible.
The New Testament.
And how many copies is that?
To date, archaeologists have recovered 5,843 Greek New Testament manuscripts. That's 4 times as many as the Iliad.
Really?
The earliest fragment of the Gospel of John was found in ancient Egypt, and it dates to 2nd century AD.
How close is that to the original?
Less than 30 years. I have one of the fragments in my collection. It's quite a treasure, isn't it? After the New Testament and the Iliad, the runners-up don't even come close. We only have 100 copies of Sophocles, 7 copies of Plato's tetralogies, and only 5 copies of anything by Aristotle. In fact, if you laid the surviving copies of Aristotle one on top of the other, they would make barely 4 feet. You do the same with surviving copies of the New Testament, the stack would be a mile high. Nothing else in history even comes close. How is that for reliable?
Well, Father, I certainly appreciate it. You've given me a lot of food for thought.
Entirely my pleasure.
Oh, wow. The Shroud of Turin, that is a fantastic reproduction.
The actual shroud is in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Italy, under lock and key.
Of course.
And no one's ever proven if the shroud is the actual burial cloth of the Christ. But whenever someone looks in those eyes for the first time, the Galilean who hung on the cross 2 millennia ago suddenly becomes a real person.
But why would he do it? Why allow himself to be killed? If he really is the Son of God, why not use his power to defend himself?
The answer to that is what got me out of the dirt and into the church. It's really very simple. Love.
Love.
For the delay, I'm calling from Jerusalem. I have to give a lecture any minute. I didn't want to keep you waiting.
I'll cut right to the chase.
So I've been doing research into the purported resurrection of Jesus, and I want to run a theory by you. Maybe the reason
That the tomb was empty was because Jesus' body was never there in the first place.
because we know that the Romans used to throw the bodies of crucifixion subjects to the dogs, right?
Well, there's no evidence for that, but there are specific records that didn't happen to Jesus.
And what records are those?
Well, actually, the earliest recorded accounts tell us that Jesus was properly buried in a tomb. And the Romans did allow for burial of some crucifixion victims.
But then there's something that still doesn't add up
To me about all of these supposed eyewitnesses.
that claim to have found Jesus' empty tomb.
What, the fact that they were all women?
Yeah, because we know that according to Jewish customs, women were deemed to be unreliable witnesses. Am I right?
Well, true. So why did all 4 gospel writers record that it was women who discovered the empty tomb?
I'm asking you that.
Well, if you were a first-century Jew making up this story out of thin air, then you would never say that women discovered the tomb. It would damage your case, not help it.
Okay, so maybe we're dealing with the world's most inept disciples.
Or maybe the disciples reported what actually happened and let the chips fall where they may.
Okay, all right, but you have to admit here that there is a gaping hole in all of this.
A gaping hole.
The fact that the Gospels are filled with contradictions about the empty tomb, okay? If I turned in a story that was this jumbled, I'd be out of a job. If we look through the Gospels, you start at Matthew, okay? Matthew puts Mary Magdalene and some other Mary at the tomb. You flip over to Mark, he adds Salome. You go to Luke, he adds Mary, mother of James, and then some lady named Joanna. What is that? You need a Sherpa guide to sort your way through this mess.
Sure, there are differences, but that doesn't trouble most historians.
Why? Why doesn't that trouble? It troubles me. It should trouble them.
Because the core of the story is the same in all 4. After Jesus is placed in the tomb, it's visited on Sunday morning by a small group of women, and they find the body is gone.
Now, you've studied law.
Yale law, yes.
And then you know that when policemen question several witnesses at a crime scene, they never expect the secondary details to be consistent as long as the core account is the same. In fact, if they're too similar, it's suspect.
That's true.
Well, that's exactly what we're talking about here.
The empty tomb is based on evidence, and isn't evidence your trade?
It is. Yes, but what if
The resurrection is one of the historical details that was recorded incorrectly.
How can we know? How can we ever know?
Lee, well, let me ask you something. Do you really want to know the truth, or is your mind already made up, regardless of the facts?
Oh, look, Doc.
I'm a journalist, okay? It's my job to challenge assumptions until they're proven otherwise. That's all I'm doing.
No, and I get that. But when is enough evidence enough evidence?
As much as I would like to help a fellow skeptic, what you're proposing is completely impossible.
But how can you say that? I mean, if Charles Manson can turn his followers into murderous zombies, surely the followers of the Christ cult could be convinced of their own delusions.
Listen, Hallucinations are like dreams. They happen in individual minds. They don't spread like the common cold.
Okay, so a hypnotist turns a stage full of insurance salesmen into clucking chickens. Then that's not really happening, or?
No, of course it is. The power of suggestion can be very profound. But it's one thing to be mesmerized into making animal noises. It's quite another for 500 people to have the same dream. To be honest, that would be an even bigger miracle than the resurrection itself.
And without an empty tomb, you and I, we're not even having this conversation. If Jesus recovered from his injuries, that solves that problem. All these people could have easily seen him, yes?
Yes, but I'm afraid that's not a brain issue. You need to speak to a medical doctor.
Of course. Dr. Waters, again, thank you for your time. You've been most gracious.
He wants to dispute the most significant event in human history. I feel it's important that we do it face to face, don't you?
Yeah, that's fine. I appreciate your time. So, my line of attack is this. The reason the eyewitnesses were able to see Jesus after Golgotha is because he never died on the cross.
Because if he doesn't die, there's no resurrection, yes?
That's right. So whether or not Jesus himself or someone else took him off of the cross early, or if he fakes his own death, it doesn't matter. It completely discounts every aspect of the resurrection.
Right, the swoon theory.
Yeah, but he passed out. He didn't die.
I'm afraid there's a long line of skeptics in front of you with that hypothesis.
Including only 1 billion Muslims the world over who also don't believe that Jesus died on the cross because the Quran says so.
With all due respect to Islam, the Quran was written 6 centuries after Christ. I prefer my historical sources a bit closer to accurate.
I understand, but you can see that it's possible.
Mr. Strobel, I am a medical doctor and a scientist. I have seen a great many strange phenomena in my lifetime. But the swoon theory is rubbish.
Rubbish. That's is that a medical opinion?
You know, it is, actually. Swoon theorists tend to skim over the fact that Jesus was flogged prior to his crucifixion. Do you know what happens in a Roman flogging?
Yeah, the person is lashed with a whip.
No, not lashed. Scourged and pummeled savagely. You see, the cowhide whip is braided with metal balls and bone fragments. The flesh on Jesus' back would have been shredded. The very muscles and sinews themselves laid open to exposure. The flogging itself would have left Jesus in critical condition from massive blood loss, which is why he collapsed under the weight of the cross that the Romans made him carry through town.
Okay, so is it possible that Jesus survives being spiked to the cross?
Oh, yes, you could survive it, but it's child's play compared to what comes next in a crucifixion. Slow, agonizing death by asphyxiation. Come with me. The stress on Jesus' chest muscles would have locked his lungs into the inhale position. Right? So in order to let the breath out, he would have had to shove himself up using his spiked wrists and feet, scraping his shredded back against the wood of the cross, and then sagged back down again in order to draw his next breath, which he would have had to have done over and over and over again until utter exhaustion just made it impossible. And then inevitably,
he dies, in theory, but let's remember, these soldiers, they're not doctors, okay? So maybe they took him off the cross and they thought he was dead, but in fact he wasn't.
No, of course they weren't medical doctors, they were professional killers. Right? And they were quite good at their jobs. They had to be. If a prisoner escaped alive, they themselves would be executed. Mr. Strobel, the crucifixion of Jesus is one of the best attested events in the ancient world. And, if you will, the final nail in the coffin, the swoon theory, is this. When the soldiers thrust their spear between Jesus' ribs, do you know what came out? Blood and water, which we now know is a description of pericardial effusion as a result of death by asphyxiation. This is not a condition anyone could fake. And so to answer your question, yes, it is my medical opinion that Jesus Christ died on that cross.
Excuse me, doctor.
A moment.
But I have a real problem with most of the experts that I've talked to here.
Which is?
Which is that most of them are not impartial, and if I'm going to take a guess, I would say that you are not either.
And you would be correct, sir. Though I have learned that most impartial travelers who undertake this journey rarely remain so. However, I can refer you to one of the most impartial sources that I know. Do you trust the Journal of the American Medical Association?
Of course, it is a stellar scientific journal, even I will admit that. On the physical death of Jesus, clearly the weight of the medical and historical evidence indicates that Jesus was dead before the wound to his side was inflicted. Accordingly, interpretations based on the assumption that Jesus did not die on the cross appear to be at odds with modern medical knowledge. Doc, I gotta tell you, you're not telling me what I hope to hear today.
Hey, what's the matter?
You people and your God, you just, you talk in circles. You offer just enough evidence, but never enough to be conclusive. Then you fill in all the gaps with, you just gotta have faith. It's a bunch of nonsense.
You're really irritating. You know that?
Don't start with me, Kenny.
You don't waste a lick of time bragging to all of us how great a reporter you are. So why can't you put up or shut up on this story?
What are you even talking about?
Here's where the chili meets the cheese, my friend. One of my heroes was C.S. Lewis, a man who began as a skeptic, much like yourself. At the end of his journey, you know what he said? He said, if Christianity is false, it's of zero importance. But if it's true, there's nothing more important in the entire universe.
The only way to truth is through facts.
The entire Christian faith hinges on the resurrection of Jesus. If it didn't happen, it's a house of cards.
You just have to show that Jesus died and was seen after.
How can we be sure of the reliability of those manuscripts?
Archaeologists have recovered 5,843 Greek New Testament manuscripts. Nothing else in history even comes close.
Do you trust the Journal of the American Medical Association? Yes, Jesus Christ died on that cross.
You're not telling me what I hope to hear today.
What if it is true? Wouldn't you want to know that?
The first recorded account tells us that he was buried in a tomb. The empty tomb is based on evidence. Isn't evidence your trade?
Faith is the evidence of things we can't actually see.
Any careful historian will see that the core account is consistent, even if a few of the secondary details are told from different perspectives.
500 separate people saw Jesus at the same time.
That would be an even bigger miracle than the resurrection itself.
The disciples reported what
People
actually
with
happened.
zero motivation to lie.
When is enough evidence enough evidence?
I felt something that is maybe more real than anything I've ever felt in my life.
This is not a condition anyone could
Still takes a leap of faith.
But why would he do it? It's really very simple. Love.
All right, God. You win.